Hello and welcome. I'm Danielle Ofri, Editor-in-Chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and welcome to Winning Words, a celebration of the winners of the 18th annual BLR Literary Prizes. We're so glad you can join us. This is the 44th issue of Bellevue Literary Review, and it's packed with amazing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, plus cover art by Alexander Gorlitsky. BLR is a literary journal that publishes poetry, fiction, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. We encourage you to check it out at blreview.org. For today's reading, we're going to celebrate the winners and honorable mentions of the 2023 literary prizes, and they'll be interviewed by some of BLR's editors. Today, we're going to start with fiction. BLR's Goldenberg Prize for Fiction was judged by Tony Jensen, and the winner is the story In Another Life by Laura Palmkevest. And the honorable mention went to the story Aspen by Karan Kapoor. So we'll start off with Laura Palmkevest reading an excerpt of her story, In Another Life, and joined by BLR's assistant fiction editor, Doris W. Cheng, for a short conversation. They'll be followed by Karan Kapoor reading an excerpt of her honorable mention story, Aspen.
I'm so pleased to talk to Laura Palmkevest, winner of BLR's 2023 Goldenberg Prize for Fiction, for her story In Another Life.
Thank you so much for having me.
Laura, your story depicts a Ukrainian couple whose lives have been painfully altered by the war with Russia. How did your time as a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine inform your fiction writing?
I lived in Ukraine as a Fulbright scholar from 2015 to 2016. And during that time period, the very beginnings of the war that continues in Ukraine to this day were just sort of being ignited by the annexation of Crimea and the Maidan uprising. So even though the war was still largely isolated to the eastern border of Ukraine, the war was very much underway. The death toll in 2015 had already surpassed 10,000. And the draft was in effect. So some of the colleagues in my department were being drafted into the war, and that inspired my story. And being in Ukraine was also, at this time of war, was so informative in the sense that the war is so complex that it's very, very hard to succinctly describe. But one way it's been described to me is that it's a fight of the Ukrainian people to redefine the story of their nation, separate from their Soviet past. And that is so meaningful to me as a writer, this idea of a collective and a community fighting to set their own narrative, and the idea that the stories that are being told about Ukraine and being crafted about Ukraine are a way to reimagine their identity and reimagine their future. There's also a layer to this war that centers on disinformation. And so stories are being weaponized to cast certain narratives and convince people of certain untruths. And so being a writer in that context made me so aware of the power that words can hold and narratives hold. And on the point of stories as well, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, and being there, I was so aware of how many people's stories went untold. There are areas of Ukraine that don't have a lot of access to literature or even the internet, and there are lives that just aren't really recorded, or they're not given an opportunity to share their stories. And I felt very aware of what an honor it is to be a writer, and just the duties and responsibilities that come with that role.
I think that's such a good point you make about the importance of storytelling, making art, not just despite war, but really because it's so important when, in the context of war and of the other kinds of stories that are, that risk being the dominant stories. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is a good time for you to read a bit from your story, and we can talk some more about it.
Yeah, and again, just brief context. This is a story about a fictional couple, but it draws from my time in Ukraine around 2015, when that draft was in effect and the war was starting to impact daily life. And it follows a couple who are recalibrating their ideas of the future and even their relationship in light of the arrival of war. So this is from In Another Life. The light this morning is almost the same as on the day Nadia thought she was destined to lose Kolya forever. November, trees shedding leaves, that odd inclination to strip layers just before winter's cold clamp, as though a reminder of how vulnerable humans are in comparison, how fragile and short-lived. From where she lies in bed, Nadia watches Kolya lean against the stained porcelain sink in their flat's cabinet-sized bathroom, sees him splash cold water on his face until his skin burns pink beneath his dark stubble. Under the flow of water, she hears a song in his throat, imagines a vibration beneath the scar on his neck. Where shrapnel once drove just shy of his jugular, there is no music. This habit of humming, something strange Kolya acquired from the front lines in Donetsk. One small gain, Nadia supposes, to measure against the loss. A pebble tossed into the void. More, according to Kolya. At least I got away with my head, he said when they first reunited, when the shock of seeing him nearly killed Nadia in turn. She can still picture him standing before the dust-streaked military truck, chin lifted at a proud jaunt, crooked finger pointing at his collar of bandages, directing her attention up here, away, a new mission of distraction to which he now seems duty-bound. You don't need both legs to sing, and so her once stoic Kolya, as tone-deaf as the babushkas who shout hymns in Kobylinskaya Cathedral, now drops into song throughout the day. Songs from his youth or songs from the radio, sometimes even an American song, the English tripping off his tongue, imagined bass notes bobbing his head. You don't need both legs to write, and so Kolya pens letters to the Ministry of Wounded Warriors, to the Ministry of Glory to Heroes, to the Ministry of Disabled Veterans, to the Ministry of Retributions, all equally unlikely to exist. The addresses, supposed by Nadia to be mere bureaucratic attempts at appeasement, the letters, she argues, only serving to stoke some politician's literal fire. No matter to Kolya, who only asks for more paper. You don't need both legs to be a craftsman, and so as soon as he was able, Kolya returned to his trade, daring anyone to comment on the absurdity of a man with one leg, spending his days surrounded by piles of shoes. His hands carefully complete repairs despite the tremor, this another of his soldiers' souvenirs. He dares commentary and rejects sympathy, not by a grim set to his jaw or hooded gaze, characteristics Nadia knew him capable of before, but by his insistence on aptitude. In the shop below their apartment, he arranges fixed shoes upon the counter in neat pairs for customers to collect, left and right, 280 hryvnia passed over as payment, but never pity. Bring that near him, and only then see the fight return to his eyes. But he suffers, Nadia knows. She thinks of this now again when from the bedroom in the half-light she watches Kolya prepare to shave and cut his hair, a razor and rusted scissors lying on the lip of the sink. His atrophied body, propped on crutches, presses against the porcelain basin for balance as he lathers his face. His humming is now huge, filling the space between them. It arcs into a higher pitch and cuts the still air. When he reaches for the razor, Nadia sits up in bed, the sweat-stained duvet slipping down her body, cold air rushing in. You don't need two legs for everything, but for this. Don't, Nadia says. She is rising now, feet brushing the grimy bedroom floorboards, the cracked bathroom tiles. She is beside him in 4 steps. The humming stops. Water continues flushing down the drain, clear and cold, wasted. The look in Kolya's eyes when he turns to her is not angry, not yet, just curious, as though confused about what she could possibly mean. It is an open, innocent expression. It is a face she remembers. He turned to her with an expression not dissimilar on the day she thought she was destined to lose him forever. That was the day her colleagues passed a hat to raise money so Kolya could buy boots for the war. The other professors in the English philology department greeted Nadia that chilled morning with grim faces and a plate of homemade purishkis, the delicate dough still carrying enough lingering warmth from the oven to seem slightly damp. How had her colleagues known that less than 24 hours earlier, Kolya found his summons in the post box, resting beside the blue envelope from his uncle in Kiev, congratulating him on their engagement? How had her colleagues known pierogies were Nadia's favorite, the way the sweet cream cut between her teeth with each bite? For Oksana, 2 months before had been apricot kolache. That was back when fruit was in season, when the markets billowed with color and scents and barking dogs, when it seemed the draft would never turn its spotlight gaze upon their small city.
Thank you. That was beautiful. One of the things I really love about your story is the way it dwells in a single moment. It's Nadia watching Kolya in the bathroom as he prepares to shave and cut his hair. How did you come to focus on this moment, this such a quiet moment in their life?
Yeah, I was definitely drawn to quietness and domesticity as a contrast to the war. And part of that was that daily life continues even in times of crisis. And that's such a bewildering fact. And I felt it every day in my life in Ukraine, because even though the war was very isolated in the East, as I said, back in 2015, it still impacted things such as transportation availability. Ukraine is a cash-based economy and the ATMs would run out of cash. So it was just, the war still trickled into domestic life. And I wanted to write towards that and capture that. And there's also the way that Kolya embodies that fact. His body has been broken by the war through his amputation, but he still lives. His hair still grows. And that's the image that really launched the story for me, is the resilience captured in that fact that his body is still thriving and moving forward, even as other parts of him are failing and ill.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the point you made earlier, just about how do you write about something as big as war? I mean, how do you like capture, such a complex, large subject? And I think it is really powerful to focus on that very personal human moment of people who are affected by it. And your story is, it's very short. I mean, it's only a few pages, but the characters are just so psychologically complex, and they're so real, and we care about them. What do you think happens next for them and for people like them who are living in that kind of situation?
I think your question just gets right to the heart of one of the central concerns of both people living in Ukraine, people who care about Ukraine and watching Ukraine, is what happens next. And the reality of war is that the future dissolves. And that's really what I'm writing towards in this story too, is Nadia had these grand plans and these visions for her life, as almost everyone does. And when the ground sort of gets shaken under their feet by war, none of those, the mind narrows, the future doesn't get as much consideration. And if it does, it's really harrowing questions like, will my city be razed, or will my family survive? And so the question of what happens next is, for these characters, likely extremely loud in their minds at the same time as their perception of the future has become very constricted and contained, which also speaks to the claustrophobia of placing them in this very small bathroom together. So it's almost impossible to imagine what happens next for them. But at the same time, I do think there's a hopeful tone to the story, precisely because their relationship is steady despite everything shifting and all of their perspectives and hopes shifting. They still are together. There's intimations that Kolya may not be well enough to see much into the future, but for the moment of the story, they're together. And I think that matters a great deal. And it also speaks to the strength of community that I saw in Ukraine at all levels. People were so willing to help one another. And I think that existed even before the war. They're very community-oriented culture. And so I just like thinking that there is hope in that fact of togetherness.
That's great. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
My name is Karan Kapoor, and this is an excerpt from my short story, Aspen. It's a story about a young woman who's having an affair with a much older married man. He's taken her with him to a summer professional conference in Aspen, which he blows off in favor of fishing. In this scene, they're at the Roaring Fork River, and he has wandered upstream after giving her a quick lesson in fly casting. Left on her own, she was forced to study her surroundings, and for the first time saw that she was a dot in the landscape. The vistas went on for miles, and yet the peaks of the Rockies looked close enough to touch. She was a suburban girl, used to seeing only as far as she could reach, and though it made her feel small, it was also thrilling. For a long time, she simply stood, feeling the warm sun on her shoulders and the cool water lapping at her legs, hearing only birdsong and the chuckle of water over rock. I've been to Aspen in the winter when it's all stark drama with blue shelves of ice and jagged white peaks veined in black. Aspen's summer beauty is more insidious. The mountains look soft, covered in emerald, dotted with wildflowers. The sky is a shade of blue you've never actually seen before, and the air smells of pinyon pine and effervescence. Then there are the aspens themselves. There's nothing quite like wind on an aspen grove, and in Aspen in summer there is always wind. The wind becomes a visible thing on the aspens, creates a texture as though the hand of God were moving through, ruffling the nap of the grove. That movement comes not from the leaves themselves, but the shape of the stems. Square in cross-section, they twist forward and back, taking the brunt of the wind and sparing the trunks, sacrificing themselves for the sake of the whole. Across the river from where she stood was a grove of aspens, and she studied them in their dance. They're called quaking aspens, but to her, their movement looked more like a shimmer, like paillettes on a cocktail dress. Later, when she would think about Aspen and try to make sense of what had happened there, she would seek out information about those trees. The outer layer of an aspen trunk doesn't heal the way other trees do. Once marked by a bear or a calloused lover with a penknife, it will carry the black scar for life. But aspens are survivors. Firemen sometimes refer to them as the asbestos tree for their ability to survive a blaze. When they do burn, the roots are hardy, and within weeks, runners will begin the task of repopulating the grove. What she was experiencing on that river at that moment was peace, simple peace. She didn't know then how rare such moments are, how unless you learn to protect yourself, the world will crowd in, making a wreckage of whatever little patch of ground you've managed to claim. In her young life, there wasn't much she'd wanted that she hadn't gotten. She would learn.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Doris. And thank you, Karan. We now turn to nonfiction. BLR's Felice Buckvar Prize for Nonfiction was judged by Rana Oddish. And the winner was the essay Lost Vessels by Jean Dubrow. An honorable mention went to the essay Your Cane by Sabah Parsa. We'll start with Jean Dubrow, and she'll read an excerpt of her essay Lost Vessels. And then she'll be joined in conversation by BLR's assistant nonfiction editor, Scott Oglesby. And they'll be followed by Sabah Parsa, who will read an excerpt of her honorable mention essay, Your Cane.
This is a piece about the death of my cousin, Adam, who died from an opioid overdose. But the essay blends meditation on art with meditation on how we write about people who we don't know very well, with an examination of the opioid crisis in America. So these are the opening pages of Lost Vessels. Years ago, I went to an exhibit of ancient ceramics so beautiful that for months after I dreamed about them. Displayed behind glass, they were of all colors and sizes, decorative and practical, formed on the wheels of Japanese potters across many centuries. I remember a bowl so large it could have been used to bathe a newborn, although its walls were as thin as an April leaf and the same translucent green. I remember shades of clay layered like earth on earth, and something glazed a cornflower blue, as if blossoms had been turned vitreous and permanent. But a long time later, when I sought out evidence of what I'd seen, a newspaper article, a photograph perhaps, I couldn't find the year or the name of the show. Proof of the exhibit seemed to have disappeared. The ceramics existed now only as glistening shapes in my memory. Only in the barely lighted rooms of imagination could I open one of the cases and remove a cup, hold its roundness in the curve of my palm, and run my finger along its edge. Beyond the ceramic objects I'd seen, I remembered the building that housed them, the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, which is part of the National Museum of Asian Art. These days, it takes a series of clicks through the Smithsonian's website to access the page that lists Arthur M. Sackler as the principal benefactor of the museum. The biography tells us that he devoted his professional career to the advancement of medicine, but he also had a passion for collecting Asian art, which ultimately became one of the foundations of the museum. People who knew my cousin Adam well described him as a sweet boy. Even as an adult, his features remained round as a boy's. And maybe it is kinder to think of him as always young, sucking his thumb, falling asleep against his older brother. Remembered like this, he remains a child, unable to twist open a plastic bottle with its safety cap. He is forever years away from his first opioid. No one would have called Arthur M. Sackler sweet. His presence on museum sides and in promotional materials is now barely visible, as if a heavy curtain has been drawn across the man. In recent years, the Louvre renamed its Sackler wing of Oriental Antiquities. The National Portrait Gallery turned down a £1 million gift from the Sackler family. The Guggenheim Museum, the Tate, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art announced they would no longer accept donations from the Sacklers. The Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art is legally prohibited from striking Arthur M. Sackler altogether from its edifices, but in 2019 it underwent a major rebranding campaign. Here's the thing. The Sackler name has come to mean OxyContin. It's hard to take pleasure in the beauty of a lighted display of pale jade cups and bowls when one is distracted by thoughts of powdery white, extended release tablets that have killed so many. When I think of OxyContin, I'm led to hazy and smoke-filled thoughts of my cousin. I barely knew Adam. If I try, I can more easily summon an image of one of the lost vessels from that vanished exhibit at the Sackler Gallery than I can my cousin's face. When he does appear clearly, it is his large hands I remember. They hold a peanut butter sandwich or finger the red stitches of a baseball. People are meant to be touched or to touch, unlike precious objects in a museum. Purdue Pharma released OxyContin in 1995, 8 years after Arthur M. Sackler's death. A statement on the Smithsonian site takes great pains, a careless idiom, takes great pains, to emphasize that Arthur Sackler died several years before his younger brothers, Raymond and Mortimer, launched Purdue Pharma, the company behind OxyContin. He is not named in any of the current lawsuits against the company. But he did own a third of Purdue Frederick, the predecessor of Purdue Pharma. He built his wealth on the marketing of pharmaceuticals. His tactics could be dishonest, and he possessed a genius for identifying ways to increase demands for drugs that had limited applications. In the 1960s, for instance, he developed a campaign that urged doctors to prescribe Valium for non-psychiatric symptoms. Decades later, Purdue Pharma would employ a similar strategy with OxyContin, downplaying the drug's potential for addiction while persuading doctors that it was safe for chronic pain. As an analgesic for pain associated with surgery or cancer, OxyContin had a limited, short-term patient base. But prescribed to help muffle the hurt of cracked vertebrae, swollen finger joints, or generalized muscle aches, well, this was a drug that could generate billions of dollars. My memories of Adam come from childhood when my family used to visit my grandmother at her condominium in Miami. I can picture him in those rooms of dense brown carpeting and gold-mirrored walls, his rounded cheeks and coiled blonde curls. Adam was gentler in those moments, his sturdiness softened. Although 3 years younger, he easily outweighed me and was several inches taller. He could be rough. An only child at the time, I wasn't yet used to the bruising play of boys and often ran from his contests. When he played Thumb Wars, 1, 2, 3, 4, I declare a thumb war, he pinned down mine much longer than the obligatory 3 seconds, his fingers turning pale under his grip. I ran from Jeffrey as well, who preferred taunts over physical power. He could make me cry with a few whispers. What a baby, he'd say, or stupid girl. Their father was still around in those years, laughing somewhere in the background of every room. He was a man most at ease in the clamor of a party, a glass of some liquid seated in his palm, the ice sliding from side to side with any wide gesture of his hand. Once I asked my mother what she thought of my uncle. We were sitting close together on a white plastic chaise beside a swimming pool while she rubbed smears of sunscreen in my arms. I watched the swish of water, wishing I could leap into the turquoise glittering where my cousins already splashed. That man could charm a snake, my mother said. She drew a line of sunscreen down the length of my nose. If she was around, I would never burn, never enter the pool without my water wings. He could charm a snake, she repeated.
So hello, Jehanne.
Hi. Hi, Scott. Great to see you.
I loved your story, and one thing I don't want to say before I forget, your titles, Lost Vessels, I thought was wonderful, but I did want to mention one of the poems that you wrote, Bruise in the Shape of a Hand, which I thought was one of the best titles of a poem I've ever seen, because it said so much in just the title. You knew where you were going with that immediately. I was also interested in all of the books of poetry that you had, and the titles. The Civilians, the one you're working on now, I understand is about Army and Navy wives or spouses, I should say.
It's the third book in a sort of trilogy that I've written. My husband was career Navy for 20 years. And so the first book in that series, Stateside, was about the experience of going through a deployment. And then Dots and Dashes looked more at the fact that I was part for so long of two communities, the community of academia to which I belong, and then of course that of military families. And then Civilians is now thinking about what it means when somebody is no longer in the military and they take off that uniform, and what does that mean for a relationship?
Wow. I'm sure it's wonderful. I can't wait to see those. And I understand you have two other books too, though, the Naturalist that you're working on, your poetry book, and also Frivolity, a defense of of the frivolous objects and pursuits we might think, which I thought was an interesting thing considering the seriousness of Lost Vessels. Gosh. How did you keep the balance in writing Lost Vessels? Was a main question I wanted to ask you, because you went from the Sacklers to medical malfeasance to your cousin. How did you manage to go back and forth and have it be so cohesive?
Well, that's sort of a mode that I work in when I'm working in nonfiction. I'm very interested in the intersection of research and a more lyric voice, and the kinds of frictions and juxtapositions that creates. And so for me, it seemed natural, for writing about the opioid epidemic, that obviously I couldn't just talk about my own limited contact with it, that I needed to contextualize it. And because this essay is part of a collection of essays about visual art, that was actually my initial entry point into writing the essay, was thinking about this exhibit that I went to that had such an impact on me, but that later on I couldn't find any evidence of it having ever occurred. And then the fact that it took place, it was at that particular museum, suddenly began to resonate with me in a personal way too.
One of the things in your story in Lost Vessels was the poker party.
I mean, in the essay, I'm actually an observer to this poker game because, and I think this remains true of me, I have such a fear of gambling in general and of addictive pursuits. And so I think even as a 12-year-old or 13-year-old watching these boys play poker so seriously, it
Yeah.
frightened me and confused me, especially the fact that they were holding one another to their debts. That shocked me as a child.
I was shocked when I read it. That children that age were already keeping score with money. Gosh, it does say something about the stakes, even at that age, and it was a fine balance. I thought you kept with that. And was there anything in particular that you wanted to leave the reader with at the end of that story? It was.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the point of the essay is that even if we don't have addictions, we can be deeply flawed human beings. And the version of myself that I present on the page in that essay, the persona, is flawed. And in that she cares more times about beautiful works of art than she does about human beings. And obviously, that's a real problem. So I wanted to, in some ways, be particularly harsh on the version of myself who is presented in the essay.
I thought the self-criticism was notable, and the fact that you went to the frailty of memory as opposed to attacking the Sacklers and all of that, which was well documented, of course, but the fact that you got it back to memory. I remember you mentioned Mark Doty a couple of times, a couple of his quotes.
Well, he says that memory is a form in itself. And of course, he's speaking like me as a poet who also works in nonfiction. And I think that's why Doty is such an important role model for me, because he was one of the writers who taught me how, as a poet, you could move to writing prose as well.
I understand that Los Vessels is going to be in your next nonfiction book, which comes out this year at the University of New Mexico Press. Can you tell us the title and more about the book?
Yeah, the book is called Exhibitions, Essays on Art and Atrocity. And all of the essays in the book in some way examine a work of art or think about the self in relation to a piece of art. But specifically, mostly I'm thinking about representations of war, genocide. I'm really interested in the problem of the beautiful, that the beautiful usually seems indifferent to what's happening around it. Beauty doesn't care if a genocide is happening, a few feet away. It can often exist nonetheless. And so a lot of the essays are about reflecting on what a scholar might call issues of representation. So the ethical issues that arise when you try to represent historically rooted traumas, for instance. So.
In the future, are you think you're going to be writing more nonfiction or more poetry?
I try to balance them. So as you mentioned, I have 3 projects going simultaneously. I like to do that because it prevents writer's block for me. So I'm always working on a poetry collection of some kind, and then some kind of nonfiction collection. So that, for instance, that book called Frivolity, a Defense is a book-length lyric essay advocating for frivolous things and pursuits. But I'm also writing a collection of poetry called The Naturalist, which is about the relationship between the health of the body and the health of the body politic. So.
Well, that should give you a lot of things to write about, given the current climate.
That's right.
To say the least.
Yeah.
Gosh. Well, I truly hope that you have much success in the future. I don't think you'll have any problem in that area.
Thank you, Scott.
My name is Sabah Parsa, and I'll be reading from my essay titled Your Cane. I wrote this as a letter to my grandfather shortly after he passed away in 2021, reflecting on his illness, but also some sweeter moments of his life. And I hope this honors his memory. The nurse said you had a beautiful cane. She was right. It was mahogany, with intricate designs etched in. It looked ordinary from afar, but a closer look revealed the swirls adorning its length. The only undecorated parts were the purely functional ones, the modest handle always in your grip, and the thick rubber casing on the bottom. I still remember the sound of the rubber thumping rhythmically against the carpet as you walked, slow and steady. Whenever I heard it, I knew it was you. On college breaks, I'd be watching TV at 1 a.m, eating snacks on the couch when I'd hear you coming down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. You would ask in Farsi, with a slight lisp, because you weren't wearing your dentures, "You haven't slept yet, Baba?" And I'd laugh and say no. In Farsi, fathers and children call each other Baba, but you simply use Ba for Mom and her brother Dai. Sammy and I inherited the title of Baba. These late-night meetings became routine. You'd make your way to the fridge and pour a cup of cold water, which you were supposed to limit because of dialysis, but to you, medical advice was merely a suggestion. Mamani slept soundly in the bed you shared, unable to protest. You knew that, unlike your wife, your granddaughter wouldn't say anything. So you would drink, and I would eat, and then you would thump, 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 back upstairs. When Sammy and I arrived at the dialysis center that day, your nurse was waiting with you. I could hear you wheezing and gasping for breath as we helped settle you into the back seat of the car. I sped to the emergency room as your wheezing grew worse. I don't remember if I said anything to you, if I told you we'd be there soon, if I told you it would be okay. I just remember wondering if you'd make it to the hospital at all. In the ER, they gave you a wheelchair, but you held on to your cane, even though you had no use for it while sitting down. I rubbed your back as you wheezed. You wore your favorite blue Columbia fleece, even though it was April. You were always cold. We waited like this for a while, until a nurse finally arrived to retrieve you. Mom arrived around this time, and we silently agreed she would be the one to escort you to the examination room with the nurse. I waved as they wheeled you away. You could barely breathe, but you waved back. Do you remember? Before you started dialysis, we got a call from our neighbor. She said she saw you under her cherry tree, lifting your cane to swat at the branches, and then bending down to pick up the fallen cherries for a snack. Mamani was furious. She had you on a strict diet to protect your kidneys, terrified of letting you eat anything other than steamed vegetables. Even your children, Mom and Dai, tried lecturing you, but I knew you didn't regret it. The sour taste you adored was still in your mouth.
Thank you, Jehanne. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Sabah. And now last, but definitely not least, is poetry. This year's BLR John and Eileen Allman Prize for Poetry was judged by Philip B. Williams. And the winner was the poem Etymology of Chlorophyll by Carolyn Harper New. Honorable mention went to the poem There Is No Time by Karan Kapoor. We'll start off with Caroline reading her winning poem, Etymology of Chlorophyll. Then she'll be joined in conversation by BLR's assistant poetry editor, Abba Belgrave. They'll be followed by Karan Kapoor reading his honorable mention poem, There Is No Time Here.
Etymology of Chlorophyll. If fingers could dig you like lichen from my lexicon, in illness I lap what is left of you from my tongue, knowing to eliminate is to loiter, and loiter is in the same language as love, as laceration, as love. We both used to say as much, though I admit at first I pretended not to. I love, you liar. I love, you lick. I love you limp and lily dark, you lovely lump. Lewd as lamb, you say I was a lark laid warm by my wing bones to your chest. What do you expect? From this angle, a beak can do nothing but say, and certain languages are sharpest dangled by the roots. Love, from Germanic lufu, is intestinal and milky, like undug onions squeezed from mothers. Love is not Latin, poised for markets, smooth and sellable. If we did love in a sooth and soluble way, we'd say amor, as in enamored or unarmored. Or maybe fill, as in I philosophize you, philander you, fillet you, my lovely philodendron. In another language, I would let my leaves grow leggy and long, languish on your windowsill without returning any kind of sun. What word can tolerate roots umbilically long? In the language of philodendrons, there is no word for lupus, so I, philodendron, cannot say this to you. Diagnoses are intimately designed for a future, and philodendrons speak only in present tense as I tuck what's left of my tongue into teeth. Lupus, like scissors. Lupus, like a loose leaf. When you call for no other reason than to hear what the doctor said, I lyre, I lick, I limp lily green, and leave you, Phil, as in chlorophyll, is all.
Thank you so much for reading that, Caroline. It is such a beautiful poem. And when me and my colleagues and I read it and we were talking about it, it's so beautiful. We're talking about the language and the play between chlorophyll and philodendron and the plant life and all that. And I was just wondering, that's my first question, what was the process like for writing this poem, honestly? Like, what was your thought process when you were writing it?
Yeah, when I was writing this, it involves a little of my own story. I was living in Madagascar before Michigan, where I am now, and I was going through strange medical issues that were never quite resolved, and there were never names given to the things that were happening. No one quite knew, and so as I found myself trying to write about the experience, I didn't have the words given to me to use. At the same time, I was going through a relationship that was on the rocks, but still involved a lot of care. And there's even, a question of where to draw boundaries around caretaking and what you even say to someone and the information that you share. So it all became this experience that I found the words just didn't exist for. So I found myself turning, as I was trying to communicate what was happening, to other, languages and lexicons and things that eventually made their way into the poem, often through sound, just how the very word kind of makes you feel when you listen to it, rather sometimes even than what it means.
That was one thing that really struck me in reading the poem over and over again, like the musicality of it, like that introduction with the L sounds and the way those L sounds change. What is your relationship to music in your poems in general? Do you generally go into each poem thinking you're going to have the music and the sound of it kind of like be kind of sing-songy, like the L that keeps repeating all the way through and then changes to that, the enamored and armored? Is musicality part of like what you strive to work through in your poems?
Yeah, I find that for me, the musicality kind of comes first in that first draft of a poem. It's kind of what drives the words onto the page. And then oftentimes it can even be a rope that kind of gets wrapped around your ankles as you're writing. You realize you're trying to get out of these little measures you've made for yourself, and it becomes very difficult. So for me, it's kind of a natural impetus that starts the poem. And then when you realize you have a poem that you want to be sent out in the world, that you want other people to understand, that's when I find myself going in and sometimes actually having to cut a lot of the music out to make room for clarity or other things. But for me, it's one of the very foundational things that kind of starts a poem on the page.
I love that. I tend to do the same thing in my own poem. So in reading your poem and seeing how, but even within those sounds, like you still manage to be disruptive or to, signal changes. I mean, that first line is a conditional statement, right? It's if I could, lichen, lexicon. So you have the L butting up against the C sound and it sounds abrasive. and then you ease into, I lock what is left of you from my tongue. And I was just wondering how you talked about words meaning and finding words for the illness that you were, uncovering and living through while in Madagascar. And I'm wondering if that is why the title, Etymology of the Chlorophyll, is the frame for the poem, and how did you come up with the title, obviously, given the fact that you said that you start from musicality and start from language and language play in your poems.
Yeah, thinking back, I'm trying to remember what the poem was originally titled. And I don't think it was this. I think it was another word in the poem, etymology of love, or etymology of lupus or illness or something like that. And it kind of goes back to even when I was showing this poem to people. It went through very little editing, because I found that people always, everyone had one little thing that was a little not quite precise. Because nothing in the poem is quite precise. It's all about kind of like dancing around this word that doesn't quite exist. And so eventually, I think when I came to what the poem should be called, I couldn't quite decide if it was about love or if it was about illness or it was about, what exactly was at the heart. And so I decided the chlorophyll, kind of the plant, being in some ways, the only stable feature in the poem, the only stable character, would be kind of how the title would come about, that it would be drawn back to the one thing that we could kind of rely on in the poem, chlorophyll.
I think that's like, that title really does, as a frame, give the reader, I think, a place to question the you, because the you is very personal, obviously, but it also works on multiple levels. You have the you that is clearly the relationship that is underpinning this. It's definitely underpinning it in the beginning and the end of the poem. But the you then seems to be talking about the illness, like especially in the middle of the poem where you're untangling the language. And I love the line, you say I was locked, laid warm by my wing bones to your chest. And it's so intimate, that image. And the images of your poem are so beautiful. And I was just wondering if the you feels both manifest and very specific, but what was your thought in braiding those threads together? Like, you have the plant life, you have the illness, you have the relationship, and you've woven all this together in this beautiful poem. And yet, I wonder if this poem, if you conceive this poem as being a poem that answers its own questions, or if you want the reader to create their own answers because of how it works on so many different levels.
Yeah, it's a very insightful read of the poem. It's interesting because in some ways you're spot on with one of the first things you said about who the you even is. In some points it seems like a relationship, in some points it's other things in the poem. And I think what was kind of driving the poem is that there were these things that needed to be said, and there was another character that we couldn't say them to, or there was for some reason, a need to withhold that despite there being a lot to be said. So the you kind of becomes this moving object of which we're trying to communicate this tenderness without exactly having a clear landing point. And with that, I think, the reader's interpretation comes in to play quite a bit as far as where the reader allows that tenderness to fall for themselves. I think relationships of all sorts are very hairy and complex things, and we all deal at some point with what we withhold and what we give to them. And I imagine that, or I hope that when someone would read the poem, they kind of can relate to that feeling of, where they place the tenderness and who they're actually speaking to in their writing.
You say tenderness, but I think there's still also an undercurrent of violence in this poem. And in researching what you write about and being very interested in like the ekphrastic work that you do, especially and like in your paintings, I was thinking about that when I kept rereading the poem. Like, I lop and loiter, but then it's as laceration. And so I was wondering if the ways in which processing your journey through like investigation with like illness, etc., felt like being, injured, felt like having violence being done upon you, because the medical system is the medical system, and as patients we are treated as though we don't have agency. And I wonder if that is part of like the undercurrent of this poem that is speaking through love, speaking through the philodendrons with their lovely leaves, but it's also speaking to care and caring for the self. I love this poem so much, and I really do enjoy the way in which when I get to the end of the poem, every single time I'm like, that last line is sad, but also like loving, but also, you know, you exit the poem and you get this very real sense of, you know, sorrow, yes, but also just like love and care. And I was wondering if in writing this poem and in having that language play and having the movement between, you know, the Germanic Lufu and all of that, it's a very, very smart, and it could be a cerebral poem without a heart, and yet the heart is so much a part of it. And it's such a deft poem in that way. And I was wondering if in writing this poem, it helped you, you know, process like your own journey through illness.
It's funny, I find that illness is something that's incredibly difficult to write about for me in a way that you know, you're trying to translate a very bodily experience into words, and there's a massive gap between that. And it's interesting what you said about the medical system and kind of even the love and violence embedded in that itself. The collection in which this poem is a part of kind of explores love's potential for violence and the consequences of devotion, which I think play heavily into that of, you know, even working with medical providers in this experience. I had some that were incredibly careful and thoughtful, and both made discoveries and messed up despite their best intentions. And then I had others that were less so, and, you know, contribute both positive and negative things to kind of that healing process. So there's never kind of that clean cut, love is good, violence is bad. They're always kind of intertwined in any area of life that we're in. And I found that indeed that came in kind of working through the medical systems as well, both in the US and in Madagascar, because kind of going between them was also a very different experience. Yeah.
And in thinking about language of devotion, are there any poet mentors or are there any writers you turned to while, you know, going through this journey of writing this poem of like, you know, journeying into the, you know, chronic illness world, that you reached out to when you were writing this poem, or just like going through the discussion of yourself with, you know, illness in general?
That's interesting. I can't think of anyone that I reached out to during this specific time of writing the poem. I wrote this right as I returned in 2020. The pandemic was going on. It was also the first time I kind of stepped into the world of poetry. I was doing very different things before that. So in some ways, this came from a group of poems that felt like they were being written at a time when I was very alone in my writing and kind of discovering it for the first time. And I would say that later on, as I kind of began reading more and discovering authors and whatnot, there were others that I turned to for similar reasons, if not necessarily themes of illness. But I would say Tracy Brimhall was an author I was reading a lot over the past couple of years, and the way she writes of loss and kind of the obsession of loss and how we work through it painfully again and again and again and again, and whether it gets resolved is an entirely different issue than how we sit with it. I would say that the way that she approaches that maybe influenced kind of the work that came after this, that this work kind of spurred. But this is a unique poem because it was kind of in that little empty holding space of pandemic beginning and also beginning as a writer.
Oh, thank you for that. It's a beautiful poem for you to say that this was, you know, conceived of in a way and is part of like your journey into becoming a poet. That's amazing. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Caroline. This has been a lovely, I hope you see more of your work out in the world. I'm thrilled that, you know, you were able to like reward your hard work on this poem. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for, you know, this lovely, lovely conversation.
Yeah, thank you for appreciating my work. It's been a real honor to see it, you know, appreciated from Bellevue, and the interview's been lovely. So thank you so much for spending the time with it.
No time here. Your illness, a kind of solvent dissolving the future a little at a time. Mark Doty. No time here is what I was trying to say when they said it's a metaphor for death. No. No time simply suggests that time has stopped and she is stuck in her disease, a fly in honey. There is no time here, but the bananas sitting still on the table are rotting. The dead have only the past to offer. There is no time here to think about the rotting bananas, let them rot. No, I do not mean they rot like flesh. Flesh rots when the body is untended. And no, the bananas rot not like cancer rots the lungs, but like leaves that turn from green to yellow to dust. There is no time here, but time has been here. And time has a monopoly over the bananas and all else. And no, not the way cancer monopolizes your cells. No, do not assume my grandmother has cancer. I am trying to say there is no time here, and her eyes are blinking like stars in a river on a clear night. Slow, slow. And not slow like time, but slow like death walking toward a dying person. You are forgetting there is no time here, and nobody is dying. I look at my grandmother, and no, her hands are not green turning to yellow, to dust.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Abba, and thank you, Karan. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to add a special thank you to the Goldenberg and Buckfar families who sponsor BLR's fiction and nonfiction prizes, as well as to board members Lynn Lombardi and Lesma Fraser, who support the Allen Poetry Prize. And I also want to acknowledge all the BLR editors and reviewers who bring all this wonderful writing to the page. Thank you to all the writers who contributed to BLR's 44th issue. And if you haven't gotten your copy of BLR yet, please visit us at www.blreview.org. You can see BLR's previous issues, read poems, stories, and essays. You can see videos, interviews, lots of stuff there. And we really hope you'll join the BLR community as a subscriber. When you become a subscriber, you are a patron of the arts. You support the BLR community and help us nurture the writing you heard today and help us to continue to bring new voices to the table. So thank you so much. Get your copy of BLR and we'll see you at the next event.